This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation. Good day to you, the viewers of Common Sense Generation. Today we are talking with an American who knows a lot about what is conservatism there in US or here in Europe. Mark Henrie with me. Thank you very much for showing up.
It's great to be here.
You are the president of Arthur N.Rupe Foundation. Tell us about what is this foundation?
Well, it's a philanthropic foundation, which means that it's a great big pile of money that Arthur N.Rupe earned during his life, which he wanted to have used for charitable purposes. And so the money is used primarily for grants to public policy think tanks. So you might have heard of some great American think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute. Those are the kinds of think tanks that we give grants to. And that's our activity.
Very American approach to resolving problems.
Yes.
Usually, but also a very beautiful one because it gives a lot of independence in the political sphere where such institutes can exist and they are separate, or at least somehow, from the ruling party or from the existing political system.
That's true, and in America we are often puzzled by Europe because it seems to us normal that a think tank would be a civil society organization, meaning that civil society would support it, and that various individuals, small donors or large donors, would say, yes, I like what these people are saying, or I want them to research a question, and so I'll give money to them. And whereas here it seems that if you want to start a think tank, they say, well, go to the government and get a grant, and so you are not really a civil society organization, you're a government appendage.
Absolutely. There's dependence on government and politics, and right now on two separate parties, which I think is a dimension of altogether the Western world that we live in dictatorship of two parties. Either one rules or the other, and the money flows from one side to the other, but still it's public money, which represents the fact that the civil society, so that the civilians are also rich enough to have this independence and thinking and creating this. It is an American approach to doing things in a beautiful way, and I think something of Europe dreams about. And I do hope that it will be achieved, but it also requires entrepreneurs who are generous enough that they don't think only about their own interests, but they have this civic role to play. And this leads us to our topic, the differences between American and European conservatism. Let's start with the American one, because you represent this one.
Yes, although I have to say that I'm talking to you as myself and not as the president of the foundation.
Absolutely.
Because the foundation has its own views, and I'm not opposed to any of the foundation's views, but I have individual views of my own. And well, where to start with American conservatism? I think I would start in the context of the New Deal, and the Great Depression and the New Deal is really when the structure of American politics began to change in a significant way. And the conservatives were those who were opposed to government takeover of many economic business functions to save the economy in crisis. And small businessmen and great businessmen were shocked by this government intrusion. And so they developed a sort of ideology of libertarianism opposed to this because the government intrusion seemed downright un-American. And so they were defending Americanism against this government intrusion. What then happened is that after the Second World War, in the context of the Cold War, there was a more complete ideology developed, I would say, in which something like a classical liberal free market view was at the center, but there was also a Christian values dimension that was thought to be important, and above all, anti-communism. And so in the context of the struggle with the Soviet Union and Soviet communism, which was an ideology that claimed to be universal, we needed an ideology that was equally universal. And so something like that emerged, and in a way, and it worked. The Free West won, and Soviet communism collapsed, so that was good. But I think that there were certain aspects of that deformed American conservative ideology. One thing which is important to think about is that Karl Marx said that the economy was the most basic thing. The means of control of the means of production is the great true fact below all social phenomenon. And so it's an economic doctrine. And I think one thing that happened was that American conservatism became classical liberal economic doctrine as the most essential thing, as a way of mirroring or contrasting with Marxism. There are other ways to be conservative besides being for free markets. And I think that what has happened since the collapse of communism is that new ideas have come into the picture. And I think American conservatism is evolving in various ways. Cultural issues are becoming a more important thing. There are some conservatives who begin to doubt that pure free markets are the answer all the time to everything. And so some of the universal aspects of the Cold War conservatism are beginning to fray. And I think that that's what's going on in America.
So to add to this, the fact that conservatism goes further than only looking at the economy and the market. I think this divides actually conservatives from the libertarians, which you mentioned at the beginning, which would like, of course, to limit the state. And to a certain extent, conservatives share this opinion, but they also see the other elements of the society which are there and which are also necessary to take part in and to think about. And to add to this framework and to conserve, and all of those are, of course, the cultural aspect, the religious aspects, and conserving the way of life as well. And I think the approach to freedom, as I think the conservatism very often wants to use freedom as a tool to create a space which then you can fill with values. When in the opposite, very often libertarians look as freedom as a ultimate value, as the goal. And at least I see this as a shift in opposition in those ways. But when we shift and we look at the modern times, and then where conservatism is there, we have this new generation which has all sort of problems which conservatives never faced before, and the main problem is, of course, the identity problem. Not only what I'm supposed to do, who I'm supposed to be in an economical way, what is my job to be, what is my profession, but here comes such problems as who am I, what is my gender identity, altogether, what is my identity? What is the American conservative answer to that?
Well, I don't think we have an answer, but I do think that you're absolutely right that something that's totally new is this great unsettling of existential parts of human life. And in a way, I might blame America for this. If you think about it, in America, America has never been an ethnic nation. There is no such thing as being an ethnic American. It was always multiracial, it was always multi-ethnic, it was from the very beginning. And so America, insofar as there is an American nation, it can only be a civic nation. It can only be an agreement about how we will live together politically. Because there's Catholics and Protestants and Jews, and there's black people and white people and Asian people. And all of them are American. And I think that's a radically different situation from the historic European nations, where there was no difficulty in knowing what a Pole was. A Pole was somebody who had Polish parents and spoke Polish and was from Poland. And I think that now that migration has occurred, the European nations are experiencing a struggle about that, about what it means to be, what does it mean to be Polish if there are also these ethnically Korean Poles
Yes.
who are here as well, and we don't share the same, there are many things we don't share. So what does it mean to be Polish if Polish includes both them and us? And I think this is a profound unsettling that's occurring globally. And where it ends, I don't know. I do know that there's a split within American conservatives between libertarians who think open borders are great. More immigrants, the better. It shows that we have a dynamic economy. And more social conservatives who think, wait a minute, this is deeply unsettling our country. And this is changing things. I don't like to see my street change. And the people who I walk by in the post office. I would rather they all speak English, for example. And and so the more socially conservative forces do want to restrict immigration. And Trump became their champion. And he may become their champion again if he wins in a few months. But it was interesting that this had been a concern for the American people for 20 or 25, 30 years, that immigration was too high. And neither party would agree to even mention it as an issue, because there were advantages to each of the two major parties to have the fairly open immigration. And so it took an outsider to raise an issue that was a very salient issue for the majority of the American people.
Extremely interesting, but also the fact that it is a country created by immigrants, but definitely those were immigrants with certain common values. And not going in extent of politics, because that's not the mean of this video podcast, but just the fact that with certain way of life comes also a certain way of values which we share, and it shapes our everyday life, and in the end it shapes also the face of the state, how we work, how we create our families, how we approach children, how we approach women, how we approach elderly, and where this Judeo-Christian values were shared by most of the immigrants which created the beginning United States. Even neither they were Jews, Protestant or Catholic. I mean, the core is after all the same. But when you suddenly in US start to have, but I think that in Europe the same thing, when we have to face a completely different set of values, a completely different way of life and approach to also the value of freedom.
Well, and something I would suggest is that
Yes.
the arrival of people who are not like the people who used to come, so people from outside of the Christian world, let's say,
Yes.
Forces us to ask questions that we never had to ask before. So, for example, and a more secular libertarian person might argue, well, we can't impose on people's freedom. They should do whatever they'd like to do. And we can't say that Judeo-Christian values are better than any other values, so long as they obey the law and agree to American democracy and freedom. And then Christians would say something different, but consider two features of our society that are features of our society. One is that you are not allowed to practice polygamy. You cannot have one man married to 2 or 3 or 4 women. There is no legal status of that because within our society, within a Christian society, only a monogamous marriage is allowed. Similarly, within our society, you may not marry your cousin. However, there are societies, Muslim societies, in Pakistan in particular, where polygamy is still practiced, not terribly widespread, but practiced, and cousin marriages make up the majority, possibly the majority of marriages in the society. And those practices, which are practices, so our practices of monogamy and no cousin marriage, are actually rules that came out of the church. It was the work of the church in the Middle Ages that made that happen in European societies, in Gothic societies, Slavic societies. And that changed who we are. Because one of the features of societies where there is cousin marriage is that there are tribes. And everyone in a society of that kind knows what tribe they are in. And so even if you go to the big city from your little village and take up a job as an IT programmer in the city in Cairo, you will almost immediately know who's in your tribe and who's not in your tribe, because tribal identity is so important. And it's hard for us to even imagine what that means and the obligations it puts on you. But having those sorts of people around is farther from our traditions than other immigrations that we have had in previous centuries and decades. And I think we have to sort of grapple with this fact. And so I think that the secular left and the libertarian right would say, oh, you're prejudiced or against people who aren't like you. You're a Christian bigot when you don't want these people to come. But I think there are very good reasons why the immigration of people who are civilizationally or culturally very unlike us will create difficulties for us because they have completely different expectations of what's normal. It probably hasn't ever occurred to you, well, maybe a polygamous marriage would be good. But if you come from a culture where that's normal, that's a question that you have to ask.
I absolutely agree, and of course there's paradoxes between two Western values, because this is actually all of those problems which you mentioned are the problems of the Western societies. As I very often ask myself, let's say a Chinese government doesn't have issues that the members of the party are not black or white or women. So they don't raise those sort of problems. Those are, this kind of questions represent the certain values which we share as a Western society. And one of those values is, of course, the value of freedom. But as I mentioned, at least for social conservatism, it's not the ultimate value. Because again, we have this clash of values between, for example, as you mentioned, the Muslim society where circumcision of women is a practice, and it is their way of life, again. And again, this violates the human rights in Western societies. So where is the balance of tolerance and respect of freedom with the respect of human rights? I of course see the very strong where we put it, but how to put it in practice, how to check it in practice, how to make laws which are actually to be obeyed. This is a difficulty which I think brings closer European conservatives and American conservatives, because as we know, for example, London is the biggest hub in Europe of women's circumcision, and police doesn't do anything.
Well, and I think on an issue of this kind, I think it's perfectly reasonable to criminalize it, and perhaps even make it criminal for parents to take their daughter to have this done. So not just the practitioner, but also the parental responsibility. I think it is perfectly reasonable to pass laws which would hold someone responsible criminally for doing this. And I think that the multicultural equality arguments are ultimately nonsense. The argument, basically, as we here in this society that you chose to come to, our view is that this is completely not allowed. And so I think that one of the problems with ideological politics is that it tries to say simple things. And so it says, you are free to do anything. So we say, in modern liberal societies, you're free to do anything. We don't really mean that. And we shouldn't really mean that. And so in America, we say, anybody can become an American. You just have to believe in the Constitution. It's like, actually, we don't really mean that. And I think that I think it's actually more honest to say, we would welcome you if you would undertake to become Polish. And we're not going to sort of force you to become a Catholic convert, but you should know what Poles know and come to value the things that Poles value. Because actually, I think of St. Augustine once. There was an interesting theoretical exchange, not an exchange, but a comment that he had on something Cicero had said several hundred years earlier. Cicero said that a city is created by agreement about law and justice, basically. That's how a city is a matter. So in a sense, modern liberalism or the modern state, America, basically is making the claim that the city is created by this sort of thin ideological agreement about rights and duties. And that's it. That's all we are, is that. Augustine basically said, no, that's not true. What makes a city is to be united around common loves. And it does seem to me that if your loves are moving in a diametrically opposite direction from the loves of those of your society, we have a problem. And I mean, they don't have to be conforming exactly, but if they're very, very disparate, you don't really have a society. You don't really have a community, and you can't really generate a common good.
Yes, and those are paradoxes which are real and true, and both US and Europe needs to face them very strongly. But now let's come to the differences between the American conservatism and European conservatism. What have you observed so far with working with both groups?
I think, first of all, I would say that conservatism in Europe, well, it's hard. This is a hard question, actually, because during the Cold War, one would have said that the Christian democratic parties were the parties of the right in Western European countries. And so the traditional right of center or center-right party, which is what Americans think of as conservatism, was the Christian Democratic Party. But the Christian Democratic Party tried to be all things to all people, and those movements grew so, what I would describe as baggy. They filled their sacks with so many things, it was hard to tell what it was. And so there was then an effort to look to Americans who had a sort of a more defined idea about what conservatism was, Of course, in the Eastern countries, there was, I think, great prestige of America after we beat the Soviets, that you wanted to model yourselves on the Americans, and so you admired Reaganite, the Reagan conservatism. So I think there was the entry of that kind of conservatism into Europe from America, an imitation of that kind of conservatism from America. But Europe has a deeper and longer tradition. The nations here, the nations are older than the American nation. And they've been through many things, through many centuries, and there's sort of, you might say there's more to conserve here, because they weren't nations that were constructed as theoretical structures. There was something already there. And so something that was already there got remodeled into a modern nation state. Monarchies gave way to republics, but there was always something more substantial. And therefore there's more to conserve, and there's more tools that can be used to conserve, rather than just the state. So I think that's something that's interesting to me about Europe. I also think that in Europe, the European political imagination is broader than the American imagination. I think in America, it's actually hard for average Americans to talk about politics except in the language of rights and duties and liberty and equality. So the sort of the classical liberal language is the only language of politics we have. Whereas I think in European nations, there are more words, more concepts that are part of the public. And so I think that there's lots of scope for conservatism to become self-conscious in Europe, although it's kind of puzzling to me sometimes, because it hasn't sort of come to self-consciousness as much as I thought it would.
And we put a point here where we develop the statement a little bit more in the next hour interview, but the self-consciousness of the conservatives in Europe and in America is a form of a goal of this video podcast. So I do hope that the viewers of Common Sense Generation had a lot of pleasure watching it. And of course, we invite you to stay tuned for another interview with Mark. And thank you for watching our show. And I thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible. This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.